Hello, good evening, everyone, and thanks very much for coming. My name is Evan Anopoulos. I'm together with Tanvir Shadouri here, co-director of the Center for Law and Society in a Global Context, which is basically organizing tonight's event. And I'm extremely happy to be welcoming Rob, who I'll introduce in a second, for this, what is effectively the inaugural event of our speaker series of the Law and Marxism series. Now, I'll give you just a very, very brief snapshot of what the series is about. Essentially, the center itself, the Center of Law and Society in a Global Context, was founded by Max Delmar. From the outset, it was supposed to work as a kind of very experimental space, if you like, to sort of consider law in its context, drawing in particular from other disciplines. And Marx really did put a lot of work into trying to build the center as sort of a more critical space. And maybe 2 years ago, I can't even remember, because it seems like the pandemic in the middle froze time, so to speak. But we set up the Capital and Power stream of the center. And the idea was really to think of context, not as law and its context, but sort of law as part of the capitalist social totality. And that's how we started thinking a little bit more and incorporating questions of capitalism in it. And then Tanvir here joined me, and we set up the Law and Marxism series at a time where really, yes, on the one hand, there was this kind of revival of Marxism more generally. But more modestly, we just were looking around and realizing that there's already a lot of people like Rob, like others in the room, that had done a lot of work trying to sort of keep the Marxist tradition and the Marxist legal tradition alive. And we wanted basically for the center to be a space which promotes that work and educates the next generation and showcasts really what you can do with Marxism and how sort of newest work you can produce and how much it can still help us to understand the contemporary moment. Now, we're still very much in our early days, but what we hope to do is in particular to reach out to scholars in other countries, particularly in the global south, and to try and dig out the sort of great work that's being done elsewhere, and also to reach out to sort of early career scholars. And I'm very happy to say that we've admitted our first PhD students in legal theory and Marxism, working on Pashukanis and Lukács. And this is exactly the sort of thing we want the center to be promoting. Now, as part of that thinking, we first set up a new books series, which is designed to sort of ask conversations around new books that have been published that draw inspiration from the Marxist legal tradition, broadly understood. And tonight is basically the inaugural of a speaker series, which will be about inviting scholars that are sort of working within those areas to share some of their more recent work. Another series that will be launching, it will be led by our PhD Fernando, and will be a reading group by our PhD students. And we hope also in the coming year or so to set up what a Marxist law school, which will be something more targeted at undergraduates in particular, to try and rethink basically the legal curriculum from a more Marxist lens. So various things, it's still under construction, and we really welcome people making suggestions about what we could do, how we could help them in their research. So we hope that this is sort of a more collective endeavor, really. And we realize we're not the first that have been thinking about how to bring Marxism into law, and neither the last ones. Now, I mean, I don't feel you need any introduction, Rob. I mean, I feel like I need to say something formal about you, which is that Tonight, it's Dr. Robert Knox, who is a senior lecturer at Liverpool, and also, among other things, on the editorial board of Historical Materialism, the journal, and also the London Review of International Law. I feel he needs no introduction because if there's one person that I've reread more than many times, other than Marx, it's him, because he has produced a lot of pieces that I at least see as groundbreaking in terms of making us think about what we can do with Marx and with the Marxist tradition more generally. Pieces like Stretch Marxism, where he uses Fanon alongside Pashukanis to think about how we might incorporate race alongside value to think of the legal form, or pieces like Strategy and Tactics, where really he introduces us to a more complex way of thinking about the role of law in emancipatory projects. So I think that a lot of us go back to again and again, so we're particularly happy to have him tonight with us and to talk about the laws, taking seriously the laws of motions of capitalism. And Tanzi would have liked to say a few words, but I think he suffered by what we call over-picketing. He's one of our most dynamic picketers, but sometimes you feel the burden of that. But Rob, over to you. He promised he'll speak for around 40 minutes and then we'll take a question.
People hear me? No? Is that a no? No. So thanks, Ava, for that very generous introduction. I think one good thing about working in the discipline of law, which is such a backwards discipline, is that you can be called groundbreaking for saying very little. And I'm going to continue that tradition today in this talk. Probably it's been, people sometimes are like, Rob, why did you choose law? And I'm like, just accidentally, but it's kind of worked out because I can say essentially banal things and sound okay. So the other thing is that me and Tanzil just got caught into a little bit of a thing because we just found out that the news strikes have been paused. Yeah, see, news. So now I've got to prepare for my classes. Yeah. No. Just found that out. So I want to open this talk with a little bit of a caveat, which is the kind of thing that I will always do, which is that when I read back the blurb that I wrote however long ago that I wrote it, I was like, wow, this talk sounds really amazing. I am not going to be living up to this. I have made a petard upon which to hoist myself. I kind of did a blurb that was essentially made of an empire of vibes, and now I find myself standing before you trying to say stuff. Essentially, I was like, well, I can think about this and this and this and this and this, but alas, once again, I'm not going to live up to that. This is especially annoying because, as some of you will know, like, the talk was initially cancelled, and my initial thoughts on the talk being cancelled were great. Now I've got time to prepare for this talk. And yet I found myself on a train, again, being like, I'm going to have to do this. So that is just to say that some of this, or a lot of this, is going to be a series of preliminary thoughts. And those preliminary thoughts are essentially about trying to think through how we might think to some degree about the contemporary state of a lot of legal theory, but also more broadly, a kind of a pop sense that people have started articulating about the relationship between law, political economy, and social change. So accordingly, at certain points, maybe this won't be as nuanced as it could be, or it might be a little bit straw man, but the sense is just to sketch out a series of positions and think about what those positions might tell us about some of the contemporary discourse around law and political economy, and where we might go forward with that, specifically in the Marxist tradition. So, as you'll have seen, and as I've already discussed, like, part of the opening to thinking about this is that in some respects, now feels like the best time to be a Marxist or someone working in the Marxist tradition in a very long time, right? And that is because more and more people across various spheres, both intellectually, politically, and otherwise, are talking about the idea of capitalism and thinking about capitalism as a kind of distinct social formation and a kind of mode of production, right? And that's really occurred over the past decades in various ways, whereby even kind of discussions which might have, 10 years ago been siloed off when we talk about capitalism, have started to be articulated in those terms and thought about in those terms. So lots of different kind of distinct political moments that we've had have been understood through the kind of prism of capitalist social relations. And that's entered back into the discourse in particular ways, right? And that is kind of valuable if you are like doing Marxist work intellectually and politically. And there's an obvious way that, some Marxists get to go on TV and denounce things and maybe make a little bit of extra money. They can build a kind of career like that. But there's also a more important thing, right? Which is to do with the important function of like naming a social system. Because insofar as people talk about capitalism specifically and not the economy or, the modern society or whatever, you do tend to ascribe to it a certain kind of historical contingency. Insofar as people think of capitalism as a kind of distinct thing, it can have a beginning and it can have an end. So there is a sense, right, in which some of this language at least points to both an alternative to capitalism and capitalism kind of historical specificity and contingency. And that is important and useful, especially in the light of, the older discourse about the end of history and the sense in which, well, we just live in an endless set of like social relations, right? At the same time, though, and part of, the major focus of what I want to think about in the context of this talk is that although contingency is good, contingency in a broad sense, like that capitalism is not the only mode of living, contingency can also go too far. And that's because historically, the term capitalism, the concept of capitalism, part of the work it has done, and in fact, a lot of the work it has done, particularly in the Marxist tradition, was not simply to be like, oh, capitalism is this thing that kind of contingently erodes and will go away. It's also been to the kind of solidity of capitalism, to the idea that it's a system with a kind of internal logic that works out, and therefore to the limits of what you can do within capitalism as a social system. So part of the reason why, radical movements start talking about the idea of capitalism is also to say, this isn't just a thing that we can wish away, and it isn't just a thing that we can be like hey, it's gone. Isn't that fantastic? And in particular, post-Marx in the Marxist tradition, capitalism was very specifically understood as naming a system that had a logic, and in particular, had these laws of motion. And part of the differentiation in some respects between the Marxist tradition and other kind of socialist traditions was that a crucial argument that Marx always made was like, this isn't a thing that we can just get rid of, get away from, because it has this kind of set of laws of motion in that way. So for Marxists, figuring out and thinking through these laws of motion was crucial for a couple of reasons, right? One reason, and we're going to return to this throughout the talk, was that it gave you a kind of a map of the way in which capitalism as a system operates. And that map is important because it can tell you points of weakness, points of strength, it can point to limits of what you can do. And so in a sense, it was a way of thinking through what agency could do. But the second point was, right, it also was meant as a kind of political device to the limits of what you could do within capitalism and remaining within it. Now, I think this is an important point of differentiation between a lot of contemporary discussions of capitalism, most broadly in a kind of like public intellectual sense, but also I think very specifically within the kind of contemporary legal literature around capitalism, around political economy more broadly, right? So a lot of the emphasis here, very specifically, is on the idea that actually the way that things are right now are very contingent. They're the products particularly of particular political choices, and alternatives can be there, right? And in some senses, there are very obvious and good reasons to do this, which is like the kind of discourse of something like Thatcherism and the end of history was to insist that, there was no alternative to like neoliberalism and capitalism. The kind of discourse around austerity has been emphasizing necessity and a kind of technocratic neutrality around what are political decisions. And so often the urge when naming capitalism is to point out the kind of politicized nature of these decisions in order to rebut the idea that what happens in the world is a result of some kind of economic necessity. And indeed, at certain points, and we're going to return to this, especially in a kind of language of Keynesianism, the argument was, indeed, this is the capitalist system showing its kind of illogical, kind of irrational excesses, because it is not even working according to its own self-proclaimed goals of growth or whatever, right? So in this way, very often when capitalism is invoked conceptually, and this is very true in terms of like contemporary legal discourse, emphasis is placed upon the kind of distributive and political choices which lie at the heart of capitalism. And indeed, at certain moments, in certain talks, when I'm being a particularly kind of grouchy, vulgar Marxist, which sometimes like I like to do, people are like, well, are you not naturalizing certain kind of choices here? Is that a problem? I don't think it is a problem for reasons I'm going to outline in this talk. And that's because I think, as I'm going to reiterate, there are some quite big dangers in taking this particular line about capitalism and its choices. I think the first thing that it often makes people do is not understand the kind of like dialectic between rationality and irrationality that happens in terms of capital and capitalist accumulation. And people can fail to understand that there is an underlying rationality, or at least logic, to the way in which capitalism functions. So often we hear this discussion about austerity as if austerity is simply a political choice, right? But then we see what happens when certain governments, certain individuals, whatever, mobilize against that and the forces they face, which perhaps makes us go, well, okay, it's a choice, but those choices bring with them kind of different weights, options, whatever. But the second point, which I think is particularly important, is that this can make our conceptions of capitalism and capital become incredibly agential, like agent focused. So it will be like, oh, what has the decision that this particular government body has made in this kind of very specific kind of will-driven way? And we need to work out who has made these decisions and why. But there's less of a sense in that context about, well, why is it that certain policies or decisions stick better than others? Why is it that at given moments, these kind of things go this way or this way? In the contemporary sphere, right, I think what this has led to very often is a kind of reheated Keynesianism, essentially, in which there's a sense of like, if only we could just get better managers of the economy, things would be so much better, so much nicer. There are particular reasons I think that's not a particularly compelling account, right? And that's what I'm going to discuss later on. So I think this is a generally important set of considerations that we might want to think about, right? And I think that we need to take seriously. But from my perspective, and presumably from some of your perspectives, it's particularly important how this links back to the discipline of law. Now, one of the things that I think is very true of the kind of emergence of a certain kind of like new Keynesian managerialism or rationality is the degree to which that is extremely strong in contemporary invocations of capitalism in the discipline of law, and that law plays very heavily in this kind of imaginary. In a sense, this story can be very flattering for lawyers because, again, as I'll explain a little bit later, the account essentially of this idea of the choices in capitalism is very often like, what are the legal choices in capitalism? What legal decisions were made or weren't made? And this can very often cast lawyers in a kind of self-proclaimed heroic moment in which they're like, well, if we were to make good laws, capitalism would be good and great and dandy. So in this sense, law is often understood as a kind of tool that could remake capitalism in a way which would at least fundamentally ameliorate its kind of worst kind of excesses. If you change the law, that you can change capital. Now, what I want to outline to some degree is a position which contests this, at least partly, and tries to make us think through at least some of the limits of that account and what it is that law might be. So, in a sense, what I want to partly do is set this idea of laws of motion, against this idea of as a kind of juridical thing and its ability to like transform the economy and what that might mean. So I'm going to start off a little bit by outlining some of Marx's thinking about capital's laws of motion. I'm partly going to talk about that in a political economic sense. I'm going to do a little bit of like talking about stuff in capital. but I also want us to think more broadly about what that conception of laws of motion means and how Marx conceptualizes them and the Marxist tradition more broadly in a quite complex way, relating the idea of kind of law-like behavior back to human agency, right? Following on from that, what I want to do is briefly do a kind of genealogy of a particular kind of moment in legal thought, which starts off to some degree with American legal realism, moves through into critical legal study, and results to some degree in a kind of contemporary law of political economy movement. And look at the way in which that conception of law sits against the idea of laws of motion. And specifically what I want to think about on that context is the way in which these articulations of law and its relationship to capitalism actually tend to demolish the idea that capital might have laws of motion, but very often through a particularly kind of like skewed and flawed understanding of what those laws of motion might be. I want to then conclude by being like, well, okay, what might it be to think about an account which both takes laws in capitalist processes seriously, but also takes seriously the idea that capital has these laws of motion, and that therefore law has to be related to those in that way. Maybe some other stuff will come up in the interim, but we shall see. So to begin with then, thinking about Marx's sense of laws of motion and what that means. So very famously, in the introduction to Capital, in one of the prefaces, Marx states the ultimate objective of capital is to lay bare the economic laws of motion of modern society. That, of course, can sound like an incredibly kind of like not great formulation. And there are moments in Capital where Marx directly analogizes what he understands to be these laws of motion in capitalist society back to kind of natural laws. Indeed, at certain points, again, in the preface, Marx kind of says, well, these laws that I'm describing are tendencies working with iron necessity towards inevitable results. And of course, it's this kind of talk, it's this kind of reasoning, which has long been a kind of site of critique by certain kind of, let's say, post-structuralist or post-Marxist accounts of the problems of Marx, a kind of mechanical like materialism in this way. And viewed in this, might actually balk at this formulation, right? As like stated in this sense, because of course, what Marx himself understood and what we all understand is that whatever you want to say about capitalism, it is ultimately rooted in the kind of conscious behavior of human beings and their social relationships. So to talk about natural laws in this context seems a little bit remiss, right? It seems like, well, sorry, but actually, if tomorrow everyone was just like, I'm kind of bored of capitalism, let's do something else. Well, in a very literal sense, there, it's over, it's done. Capitalism would not tick along without people doing it. So there can be a sense in which this particular formulation of laws, rooted back in the sense of natural laws, can be a little bit of a problem. Now, on the one hand, that is true, and we'll return to that formulation. But we can also, I think, be very skeptical of that formulation. And that skepticism helps us to get a better understanding of what Marx was talking about in the context of laws of motion and how they have a significant utility for us in thinking about like law and juridical processes. So even in the formulation where Marx is talking about tendencies and iron necessity and inevitable results, there's kind of a contradiction there because there's the mention of tendencies in relation to laws. Well, as soon as you start talking about tendencies, you are already moving away from the idea of a kind of iron inevitable process, because every tendency can have a counter tendency, and what Marx talks about, capital volume 3, in the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. So moments of inevitability already seem contradictory in that formulation. But secondly, and I think more importantly, if we start thinking a little bit more deeply about this idea of like simply deciding to not do capitalism, we can get, I think, a better sense of what it might mean to talk about laws of motion of capitalism. So obvious, simple, boring thought experiment. If I personally decided tomorrow that I wasn't going to do capitalism, and good God, sometimes we all want to, well, really quite quickly, I'm not going to make it. I'm not very good at saving money, so I don't actually have that much of it. So I would give myself, I don't know, a couple of months before I was like starved and dead. And that'd be that, right? And that's because obviously, on the basis in which I exist as an individual, capitalist social relations are not non-obligatory, right? I have certain natural needs which need to be fulfilled, like food, water, whatever. And I only have access to those natural needs, obviously, through capitalist social relations. So far, so straightforward, right? The point is, of course, that like, even if I as an individual do not immediately feel that I'm governed by these laws, I exist in a social world in which the kind of a complex set of social relations are not opt-outable. So on the one hand, we have that, right? But we could extend that metaphor or that example a little bit further and say, okay, but what if everyone simultaneously just decided to give up on capitalism, or like everyone met in a big circle, like let's do things differently? Then surely that would mean, hey, everything is fine. But even that may not be right. Firstly, obviously, the idea of everyone doing this simultaneously is, I've written highly unlikely, but I'm going to say borderline impossible, right? And that's partly because you'd have to know that everyone was going to do it at the same time. Because you wouldn't want to be the only person that was like at the party, just being like, no more capitalism for me. And everyone's like, it's up to you, you're dead now, right? And that's because more broadly, in the way in which capitalist social relations are organized, they are a kind of like form of disarticulated sociality, right? And that's crucially important also because, of course, in the context of doing things differently in capitalism, there's always someone that might stand to benefit from not doing it that way and immediately kind of making some kind of gain on that basis. But more broadly, right, the entire mode in which we reproduce our social existence is organized around capitalist social relations. If you just stop doing all of that right now, well, good luck. We'd all be, again, just over, dead, and done. That is indeed why so many revolutionary traditions have had to work out what a transition from capitalist social relations might look like. So the point here is that we can think of something like compulsion and laws in the sense that capitalist social relations are organized at a social level, which means that even if we are not directly compelled to do things, by acting against those in particular kinds of ways, we are unable to reproduce ourselves socially and unable to continue to exist. This is the core, I think, of Marx's sense of the laws of motion of capitalism. And it's a kind of tragic account in which it's like, as we all know this, Marx's kind of capitalism. Hey, capitalism is a product of collective human action, which human beings confront as if it was not a product of collective human action. As a totality, capital compels people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, because if they don't do that, they die and they don't get to survive. Now, I'm not going to dwell on that too much, but this to me is the sense of the core of what we're talking about when we're thinking about the laws of motion of capital and Marx. It's not that capitalism is this thing which arrived from space and came down with all these rules which were then just imposed upon us. It's that capitalism has a series of mechanisms embedded in the way in which we organize ourselves collectively, which means that when we confront it in that way, we are compelled to do certain things in order to continue to exist and to reproduce ourselves. Now, in Capital and other works, Marx goes through what he thinks are a series, right, of laws of motion which come from this context. And in particular, he develops arguments about how and why those laws of motion end up being compulsory behavior, even though they are just like forms of collective human endeavor. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of those, right? And that's going to help us think a little bit about the capitalist system and like how it moves. So the kind of like some of the big kind of places where Marx uses this formulation about laws are firstly, the kind of law of capitalist accumulation, which he talks about, which is the law through which capitalism tends to centralize and combine. It gets to have smaller and smaller industries, and it forms an industrial reserve army of labor. That's one kind of important law. Another is the law of the equalization of the rate of profit, whereby in different sectors of the capitalist economy, although there may be different kind of rates of profitability, that will tend to equalize because capital will move into sites that have great profitability and move out from others. And then also famously, there's this idea of the law of tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which is the rate of profit will fall down and down. So Marx manages to arrive at these as being laws of motion of the capitalist economy by teasing out what he understands to be the kind of central logic of how capitalism works and how that plays out socially. So very simply, because I don't want to be like particularly boring, like Marx obviously understands capitalism as a system that is organized around social reproduction through the generation of profit. And he understands profit as being a mystified form of surplus value, with surplus value essentially being what workers produce over and above the necessity of reproducing their own existence. And I'm not going to go massively into that, right? But it's this core idea of those two things together that enables Marx to start teasing out the way in which what is a collective social endeavor can nonetheless reflect back on humans as if it was a set of laws, right? And this is where Marx, I think, makes a kind of very brilliant, kind of Hobbesian point. It's why, as an aside, I think that Hobbes is like the greatest philosopher of capitalism. And that's this. Marx is like, look, in a world where there is capitalist competition, there are many capitalists, even if you were like the nicest individual capitalist in the world, even if you're a great guy, you play football with your kids and you give to charities or whatever, there is always a threat that other capitalists are going to seize some kind of advantage in the process of capitalist production. They don't even have to really do it, but there's always a threat that they will. That very threat, should it be actualized, would mean that they could gain some kind of productive advantage, put down their prices, drive you out of business, and therefore destroy your ability to operate as a capitalist, right? So what Marx says here is that every capitalist, understood in a kind of competitive capitalist system, has to act as if this will happen, and therefore it kind of does happen, with all capitalists constantly revolutionizing production, reducing labor costs, making things more efficient. And this is what Marx calls like the coercive law of competition, right? And this coercive law of competition operates as if it's a law of nature, because if a capitalist wants to remain a capitalist, they're continually having to do this. And from this particular set of ideas, Marx draws out the idea of laws of motion, which are essentially that competition operates in this way to force capitalists that want to continue to reproduce their own existence to do certain things. And from that, right, Marx is able to say, look, this is simply human action. This is a collective result of human action. Because of the nature of the way in which this collective economic project works, people have to act in certain ways if they want to continue to exist. So what's crucial is that Marx is not naturalizing this as a natural law. He is understanding this as a collective social process. But at the same time, it's not non-obligatory. It is obligatory. And in that sense, it operates as a kind of law of motion. Now, the reason I think this is important as a formulation, and we'll return to a little bit later, of course, is that like this obviously complicates our sense of like what a law is. Like Marx is not saying in this sense that the law is a thing that has been imposed and will always happen and will always follow. He's specifying a set of social conditions in which, this is the crucial thing, we will all act as if we are governed by natural laws, right? Irrespective of whether or not we believe or don't believe this is the case, we have to act as if these are law. We could, of course, all just tomorrow stop doing that, but the structure and nature of capitalist competition means that that's basically not going to happen because you'd be screwed. That, of course, is the reason why Marx thinks that you need to have a collective revolutionary intervention to overturn those social logics, right? And undermine that kind of pressure, right? So this is the idea broadly of laws of motion of capital as a system which, of course, is responding to human agency, but is driven by certain systemic imperatives, organized around the kind of force of competition in particular, which means that human beings will have to act as if they are governed by these laws of motion. So that is vignette one, and that is the idea of what capitalism's laws of motions do and how they kind of operate. And we can talk a little bit more at some point if we like about what that means in detail, but we need to keep it in mind as a kind of story. So what I'm now going to offer is a kind of counter story to this, which has come out of the discipline of law. Now, in the process of this, I will almost definitely kind of violently maul some intellectual traditions. I will erect a series of straw people, blah, 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 blah. This is not going to be that nuanced. This is a professional hazard of trying to do this kind of thing and writing a talk on a train. But it is what it is. And I think it still will nonetheless disclose, I think, what is a trend and a tendency, and allow us to think about what we might do differently. So one of the core claims that's made around made by contemporary scholars, critical scholars of law, and particularly in this kind of law and political economy tradition, is that this story that Marx tells, or this account, does not take the role of law seriously enough. In particular, and a long-standing critique from many people in the legal academy, right? They say, no, there's not a sense here of the ways in which law is not just a kind of external thing to these forces that are happening, but is in some sense constitutive of these processes. Now, there are various kind of variants of this position, and we'll talk through some of them and think about them today, but kind of crucial point is to say, look, this account of what would be economic law of motion crucially ignores that role that law plays in making and shaping capitalism. And specifically what many argue is, okay, the kind of positions that you're talking about, the things that shape these compulsions, be it the notion of property, be it the notion of the commodity, be it the notion of competition, are in some sense made by juridical processes. Lawmaking is also in some sense making the economy. And this is often done not just in a narrow sense of like, oh, law is involved, but it's like, it goes all the way down. It's like, well, capital is a legal construct, it's a legal concept. What we mean by capital is always law. And in that sense, they argue, well, if you want to have a market functioning, if you want any of this stuff to happen, well, then it must involve the law and a web of juridical relations. Now, very often, what happens is a second step is taken. And we'll talk through this a little bit more, but this step essentially says, if these relations are a product or constituted through law and legal decisions, then they are not a natural product. They are not naturalized in this way. They're crucially the products of human agency and human decisions. And because they are a product of law in this way, they can be changed or challenged through legal reforms and other things. So if you can change the law on this account, you can, in fact, change capitalism. And this is becoming an increasingly significant kind of move in contemporary understandings of the relationship between capitalism and law. Now, how does that then sit with an idea of laws of motion of capital? Now, I'm going to argue, surprisingly, not very well. And what I'm going to do is talk through a little bit of the kind of genealogy of how this kind of intellectually was a position arrived at, unpack what I think are some of the significant problems with that, and then offer what might be an account which takes some of this seriously, but also is able to contend with the idea that capital is at least structured through these laws of motion, and what that might mean about its relationship to law itself as a kind of social. So the kind of, this position that I've just described is retrospectively or retroactively traced back to American legal realism, right? Some of you may know this story, some of you may not. And the American legal realists are a group of American lawyers writing around the time of kind of just before and around the Roosevelt administration and his interventionist reforms. And a lot of what they did was to sort to contest the kind of rigid separation that the legal discipline had between law and economics. And partly for good reasons and partly in terms of constructing kind of canons, this movement has been really crucial in terms of constituting the kind of account or imaginary of the critical legal studies movement. And there are two kind of core lessons or two kind of core positions that the critical legal studies movement obviously took from these realists. So firstly, they took the idea that one of the things that the legal realists say is, well, ideas like property, contract, or whatever are not unitary ideas, but in fact are collections of prohibitions and permissions. They are bundled up series of different things. So property is actually, as some people put it, a bundle of rights, and those rights can be affected by different kind of legal positions. And on that account, right, what that means is that what looks like a unitary concept in fact embeds a number of different policy choices at core moments and cannot be said to be the same thing at whatever point. And that, of course, makes it very difficult to speak even about something like capital, because capital is on this account simply a bundle of different entitlements together. Now, secondly, and linked to that, what many of these kind of scholars and theorists did was to say, well, the other thing to say is that this bundle of rights and permissions will have an effect, crucially, on constituting the groundwork through which economic outcomes happen. So because capital is now a smushing together, is my technical term, of different legal entitlements, right? That means that these legal decisions are not neutral or whatever, they actually have significant economic kind of consequences. This also then leads into this idea, like for instance by Robert Lee Hale, that actually, no. We have to puncture some of these legal niceties. Like, law is not on this basis just a kind of a prohibition. It's also often a permission. It's also often a crucial element that goes into kind of economic calculations. And this was the groundwork, right, for the idea of law and lawmaking as being constitutive of capitalist social relations. Now, this list of kind of insights becomes really crucial in articulating and framing a critical legal studies response to this idea of the relationship between law and capitalism, which kind of happens in the 70s and the 80s. And there are kind of two key figures here that we can kind of briefly scale over to get a sense of where they're at and where we're at. And one of them is Mark Tushnet, who starts off as like a very kind of like bolshy Marxist figure, like, you know, there are some fun quotes from him and stuff like that, but quickly on an intellectual level, moves away from Marxism. And partly that's because he says, well, actually, legal realism kills Marxism in law, because if legal entitlements are simply these bundles of rights and decisions, and those bundles can be changed by different legal arguments, then you cannot speak of law as functionally constituting a mode of production, or of, you know, of being like in favor of capital or labor. And this collapses the whole idea, in a sense, of capital as being structured by these kind of concepts or these laws of motion, because this is all just a thick tissue of different juridical decisions. Now, Duncan Kennedy takes this significantly further. Okay, just got a text message from UCU. Thanks. Urgent, please retweet this thing, probably. Right, what he takes from this, Duncan Kennedy, is the idea that, like, okay, this actually then poses a significant alternative to traditional understandings of the way in which the relationship between law and the economy work. And that's because he says, well, actually on this basis, when we think about relationships between capital and labor, when we think about all of these kind of things, if law is constituting that and law is contestable, then we can no longer think about kind of internal logics or things moving around, because actually this is all determined by law, and law is a crucial element in this kind of distributive categories. And a crucial lesson he draws from that, of course, is that he says, well, there's no such thing as pure capitalism, or indeed, let's say capitalism. There's a combination of different kind of coercive economic regimes, right? So the position that Kennedy ended up arriving at, and I think this is a really influential position now, is this idea that because law is constitutive, you can't talk about the kind of internal logical laws of motion of capitalism, because actually that is a mess of kind of contestation, which is occurring at the juridical level. Now, if you look around at lots of contemporary legal scholarship on capitalism and on political economy, they have essentially inherited this as a kind of framework. The emphasis on the role of legal regimes in constituting specific modes of capitalist accumulation. There's much less of a sense of what the political economy of capitalism might be, and there's more sense of the way in which these legal regimes kind of do that kind of thing. Now, there are various reasons, I think, why this position is a problem. I'm going to go through some of them, and I'm going to just going to offer a little bit of an alternative. So one huge problem with a lot of this, and to be fair, Kennedy at least acknowledges this to a degree, is we have to frame all of this with the question of, okay, let's say, I'm actually willing to acknowledge on many levels, law is doing a lot of this constitutive work. But some laws are obviously more successful than others at making this work. Observe, for instance, you know, Liz Truss's glorious challenge to global capitalism, where she was like, okay, well, what I am going to do is contest what I see as an economic orthodoxy, and I will use the power of the state and certain kind of like juridical apparatuses to do that. That did not stick. It could not stick. That was partly because of a series of institutions which had a problem with that, but it was also crucially because the markets, these kind of reified, like representative capitalist competition, rejected that, which led the plan to be unviable. And indeed, you then have social democrats being like, oh, Liz Truss clashed with reality. So it's quite clear, on the one hand, that if we're thinking about the idea of law as being constitutive, we at least partly have to ask the question, well, in what context and which bits of law can be successfully constitutive? And crucially, why is that? Like, there's a sense in which we have to at least start thinking about like the work that is happening around the laws in that kind of way. And that can be particularly important, of course, because one thing that we also do know, and one thing that I think many lawyers avoid thinking about for obvious reasons, is that very often, actually, the things that are making social orders work are not juridical. Like sometimes you might have a formal set of juridical entitlements which do not reflect the way in which things actually work. We clearly know this, right? So we have this sense where it's like, oh, we need to have another question here, which is like, in what context do what laws do, what work, how, and why? And that crucially leads on to a similar question, which is like, in what states, in what geographical or geopolitical context or like socioeconomic context, can this make a lot of sense? It's probably not an accident. This is my little the snarky point that I make. It's not an accident that the place in which this kind of thinking emerges is the global hegemon, in which, yes, maybe your juridical changes can translate to the rest of the world, but it's not a position that necessarily makes as much sense anywhere else. So the question then becomes, well, okay, what are the contexts in which particular articulations of juridical power can play this constitutive role, and what are the contexts in which they don't? That, of course, lines up with another broader set of questions, which is also in what context is it primarily law that is doing this work? Because actually, you could read some of this stuff and see it as a kind of an internal, ahistorical account where it's like, well, rules always make economies. But what we know, fairly straightforwardly, as a kind of matter of historical sociology or whatever, is that no, that it's not always the case that law is able to do this work. It is only in a certain set of historical conditions that law starts to assume this role. So there's a certain kind of irony, I think, here, which is that, like, well, people that do law and political economy have neither a theory of law nor about the theory of political economy. They have a theory of some stuff happening, right? And so, crucially then, I think the question that we can ask is, well, what would be an alternative to this? If these are a set of problems, and there are more problems, I'll just, in the interest of time, not go through all of them, what is it that we might offer as a kind of alternative account? Well, the crucial thing to recognize from our discussion of Marx's conceptions of laws of motion is, look, the power, right, of some of these accounts is meant to be a denaturalizing thing. It's like what we want to do is denaturalize the idea that capitalism just works on its own and instead think about interventions of agency and stuff like that. But of course, part of the point about Marx's actual account of laws of motion is that I think on a proper reading, they are not naturalizing. Marx is specifying conditions in which collective human action can appear as if it is this way, but that is not naturalizing it in that way. Indeed, sometimes when you read some of these contemporary accounts in which they go, and the thing with Marx is, didn't really talk about law, your response kind of wants to be, did you read Marx? Because there's quite a lot of law throughout this all the time. If you go and read Capital, I mean, we commonly say like, oh, well, Marx has no theory of worked out of law. True. But you go and read Marx's political economic works, and law is doing work everywhere. Marx is very clear, actually, that transformations in the kind of birth of capitalism and the way in which it works crucially involve juridical articulations and transformations. There's not a unified account of this, but it's quite clear that it's going on. So in a kind of E.P. Thompson vein, law is really everywhere in Marx's account of capitalism. And I think this is the important thing, right? If we say, hey, it's pretty clear that for Marx, law is very important in the constitution of capitalism, but also, like, Marx wants to think about capitalism as a specific historical system that has like laws of motion in which law is working. We might have the sense in which we can think these two things together, and that's crucial through having, I think, a theoretical account of law and what it does that is not just an account of law as some kind of random rules that determine things in that kind of. So here, right, I would just obviously, I mean, the funny thing is that like, Eva, you introduced me as doing like race stuff and strategy. But of course, my first love was Yevgeny Pashikanis, and indeed for a long time, I was the second Google result for Yevgeny Pashikanis. It's a beautiful time for me when I was young and full of promise, no longer. But this kind of account, I think, gives us a better sense that can both take seriously this kind of constitutive role, or the role that law plays in capitalist social relations, whilst at the same time articulating a sense in which capitalism can have laws of motion that function well. So essentially, I think the kind of core starting point that we get from Marx, and that we can really get from Pashikanis, is, in what sounds like a simple formulation, but of course isn't, is that in part law is a form of appearance of capitalist social relations. Law does not exist in this kind of really separate way from the way in which capitalism works. Instead, law is a particular kind of like juridical angle through which capitalist social relations manifest themselves and make themselves known in the world. So it's not the case that it's like, here is law, it constitutes this. It is in fact that this set of social relations is not just, and this is obviously a crucial thing in Marx, a purely economic set of social relations, but it's a mode of this reproduction of human existence which has different forms of appearance, including, crucially, juridical forms. So in this sense, right, it's not thinking about the idea of, oh, his law, his capitalism, one constitutes the other. It's no, there's a kind of mutual interaction between these two things, in which juridical relations are the way in which capitalist social relations appear, and through which actors in capitalist societies are able to advance particular political and economic projects. What that can then lead us to is this question of which contexts in which law or laws will be successful in engaging in constitutive kind of moments, and how that relates back to the laws of motion of capitalism. And on a very vulgar level, right, what we can say is this: you can have juridical projects, right, which sit on the side, and insofar as they are not like articulating or compatible or alongside the ways in which these laws of motion function, they don't do very much. If we then think rather of law as being part and parcel of the process through which those laws of motion are made manifest, exist, and are made real, and therefore it plays both a role as conditioning that, but also crucial as being conditioned by that, we start to arrive, I think, in a very different place and context. And I'll just spend the last couple of minutes, I guess, like finishing up on that. I think a useful way of thinking this through is to think about like the story of neoliberalism, right? Because one of the crucial kind of political things that people have tried to articulate is this idea, and this is an idea to which, you know, sometimes I feel like bad saying it, but I think it's true. It's like, oh, well, neoliberalism, it was just a choice. It was a choice that elites made to do X, Y, or Z thing. Well, maybe, but it wasn't it wasn't simply a choice, right? Why do we know that? We partly know that because like the kind of ideologues of neoliberalism had been like, you know, articulating their plans for neoliberalism quite consciously for decades before it ever was enacted. And it was only enacted in the context of a specific crisis of Keynesianism in which it suddenly fit with the kind of movement that capital was then undergoing, right? So how then might we kind of articulate what that says? Well, I think the crucial thing about when we think about laws of motion in Marx specifically is that Marx does not think that laws of motion like unfold smoothly, because capitalism doesn't work like that. Capitalism is a system of disequilibriums which moves from crisis to crisis to crisis. And it's in that crisis type movement, Marx thinks, that those laws of motion assert themselves. So thinking about it in this way, right, we start to get a very different understanding of what the role of law in relation to neoliberalism might be. Not one in which it's like law arrives and its work is just to embed a policy choice which was like completely unprecedentedly whatever, but instead law as articulating a kind of set of the way in which those laws of motion were working, which doesn't exclude political agency, as I'll talk about, but it's like makes it look a little bit different, right? So to slightly pivot, there's a very good like quote by Marx. There are many very good quotes by Marx, a very quotable guy, in Volume 3 of Capital, where he's talking about like the regulation of agriculture, right? So exciting. And he is like, look, actually, all ideas of a common, all-embracing and far-sighted control over the production of raw materials, a control which is in fact incompatible by and large with the laws of capitalist production, and hence forever remains a pious wish, or is it most confined to exceptional common steps in a moment of great and pressing danger and complexity? All such ideas give way to the belief that supply and demand will eventually mutually regulate each other. And when I read this, because I'm strange, I was like, oh my God, this is Marx solving Keynesianism, because this is the idea. Okay, you can have these moments, specific moments, in which, for a combination of circumstances, you can arrange capitalist accumulation products in a particular way. But the kind of ever-present threat of competition that we've talked about, which conditions the way in which capitalist actors act, will eventually be able to burst those things forward. And that is particularly clear in the case of Keynesianism. And this is important for me because I do think very often that the sense of Keynesianism as this kind of achievement which suspended capitalist social relations underlies much of the idea of law in its kind of regulative, capitalism making function. So very quickly, right? Keynesianism itself is not a neutral kind of phenomenon. It was a phenomenon which existed in a very specific set, a very specific conjuncture, which had a very specific political economic context, right? And that context was essentially that, as we all probably know, Keynesianism presupposed essentially two things: that could maintain an acceptable profit rate for kind of capitalists in the advanced world, such that they would be have a social peace, and two, that you didn't leave any opportunity for anything to happen outside of that. Because as soon as you had the opportunity, if one capital would do it, then all the others would have to do it too, right? And the point with that is that as soon as that consensus was broken, on Marx's reading, all capitalists would be compelled upon pain of non-existence to kind of do that. So in this sense, Keynesianism is a political compromise that's built on an economic basis. And essentially that basis is in bits of the advanced capitalist world, can you design a system which will deliver robust enough profit rates to keep them going and shape capital accumulation and not give any kind of possibility of alternative? And that's crucially based both on a kind of political compromise and fear of revolution, but also on profit rates, which kind of come from the global division of labor, that come from capitalism's kind of specific of profit rates, particularly into the advanced capitalist world. But neoliberalism is not just a mean person's response to not liking this. Neoliberalism is a response to a real crisis that happens in the context of Keynesianism, which partly happens because of a more assertive, non-European, less advanced capitalist world asserting their interests, hence the kind of OPEC oil crisis and what that does in terms of the oil shock. And that crisis cannot be responded to within the kind of basis of Keynesianism because it becomes a real crisis of capitalist accumulation. And in that context, this is the way in which those laws of motion assert themselves remarkably decisively, where it's now capitals have to find ways to restore that profit weight in particular ways. And it's only in that context, right, that these laws, the legal juridical laws, can come in such a way as to shape a set of institutions which will promote that model of accumulation. Now, really importantly, in this context, it is not to say there was no choice between neoliberalism and something else. But what's crucial is that if you actually look at the moments of the struggle that was occurring in that period in the 1970s, this was essentially where movements were having to talk about going beyond Keynesianism itself and starting to challenge essentially capitalist social relations. This is the moment where trade unions were well, okay, if there is a kind of wage price spiral, which they did think there was actually in the unions in the 70s, we don't care. We're going to keep doing that until we break capitalist social relations. We're not going to make that compromise. This is the moment when the non-European world is talking about significant inroads into the way in which the economy is organized. They're going to go beyond Keynesianism in this way. So the point about this is not, there was no alternative. But the point is the alternative was not a new arrangement of capitalist social relations because those laws of motion were asserting themselves in a particular way. Instead, the choice was between a kind of political rupture or not. And law figures in that way, not then as this kind of magic bullet that did this kind of thing, but instead law figured as something which ultimately articulated those laws of motion. And that's what made these juridical projects much more successful. Now, crucially, that is also the moment, for various reasons, in which juridical and institutional forms became really central to neoliberalism, the mode of capitalist accumulation, because of the nature of the way in which law and the legal form operates. But that is not, in that case, to put the kind of cart before the horse and be well, this is an example. If only there had been better lawyers, she would have been good. That's precisely not what's happening. Instead, it's to think about that kind of mutual interpenetration between those two things. So to then very briefly conclude, what this suggests to us, right, is that if we are thinking about the role of law in this context and its relationship to laws of motion, we should, I think, be very attentive to the role that law plays in shaping capitalist social relations on a general level, but also the way in which it will help to articulate specific modes of accumulation and how that will then articulate capital's laws of motion. But we need to be extremely skeptical on this basis about what the limits of particular juridical reforms are and what it is they can achieve when faced specifically against that sense of laws of motion. We also need not just to think of law, if law is constitutive, which is in some way it is, we also have to ask the question, well, what is constituting law in this manner? So situating law in that sense and thinking about it in the context of a set of organized social relations with that kind of logic is the crucial move that I think we have to do if we're going to start thinking seriously about the relationship between law and capitalism today. And that requires, I think, a different kind of understanding of capitalism in which capital's laws of motion are taken very seriously. And I'll stop there.
So just to be clear, if you juxtapose the laws of motions with law, offer us a way to theorize it, apply it to the contemporary moment, and other than that, I'm the one who is wrong when I say that he produces groundbreaking. Because I don't know if we need that to go around for questions or.
Unless people have got particularly late.
No, I mean, yeah. So it's 10 past. We have this room until 8, but I'll try to sort of take maybe maximum half an hour questions on your kind of plates. The floor is yours. Angus.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Love to see. Fantastic talk. I'm not a legal scholar, but I am a political sociologist, and it seems like the thing that was in the talk that kind of shadowed the talk was the state. And I wondered, what is the relationship of the state and a particular state forms that emerge, particularly in the story that you told about neoliberalism, in this story about law, right? Because going back to your example about Theresa May, yes, it's a juridical product, which she tried to do, but she also did it within inside the neoliberal state, which had, importantly, separated central bank from the treasury, right? This was a central part of like some of the problems that emerged. And it seems like lots of your talk ran parallel to the debates in the 60s and 70s over what is the state, this relationship between the form and the function of the state. And I wonder what happens if we introduce the state and those debates into the analysis that you've just given us. Yeah, does it add like a layer of complexity, or just like, do we not need the state in order to make the argument that you've just made?
Big to move, but I feel it's a big question. Maybe you want
Yeah,
maybe you want to go.
I mean, so the first thing that would happen if I took the state seriously in that analysis, it would go fucking 2 hours. Like, the major thing that would be going on, but that's not to say it wouldn't be there. I mean, I think this is kind of a difficult thing, right? Like, so those debates I think are very interesting, and you can imagine to some degree, like I have some sympathies, like I'm a state derivationist guy, at least on some level, but that's kind of where I'm at. I think I want to say a couple of things though, which I think are important. The first is I think it's important to conceptually like keep law and the state separate. There's a certain kind of like vulgar account of law, which is just like it's the state will or whatever. And that's problematic like for a whole bunch of reasons. One reason is actually because so much of what law does is like pretty divorced from like a particular state imperative or particular from state organization. So I think it's important to keep those two things separate. But of course they are conceptually separate, but they are obviously in practice like distinctly interrelated. Like I don't really think you can ultimately talk about one without talking about the other in that kind of way. So then thinking about like the relationship between like state forms and juridical forms, this of course is one of the instances in which I do think like the kind of mutually constitutive thing of thinking these two things together is important, because one of the distinct moments of like the kind of or tendencies of the neoliberal moment is taking existing tendencies towards juridicalizing various functions and aspects of the state and articulating them at different levels, right? So it is important to say that like part of the way in which neoliberalism gets stabilized and continues, and I would not deny this at all, is through the per se use of like these kind of juridical like structures which relate to the state in particular kind of ways, and indeed through often a kind of internal juridicalization of the state itself. So an interesting thing in the story of Liz Truss is that like a thing that became a critical thing against her was also the OBR, which is a thing created by the Conservative Party as a way of like self-enforcing austerity, but then turns back upon her at that key moment, and you have the bizarre spectacle of like Polly Toynbee being like, if only they'd listened to the OBR. So this is, of course, is a crucial part of doing that. And thinking about the relationship between state forms and legal forms is, I think, a crucial part of the story. But I think the reason that I pushed the way that I did is, well, partly because I'm in a discipline, I've got to work in that discipline, right? But also because I think that very often state forms can receive like more attention than juridical forms in this kind of context, and it's important for us to think about those juridical forms. I think these two things are internally related in important ways, but we do need to think about the specificity and seriousness of the juridical forms in that kind of context. So I don't think you can tell the whole story about this at all. But I also think that then an interesting thing becomes, right, and I know actually your work has also kind of like touched upon this to a degree, is that also when we introduce like the particular kind of like forms of internationalization of capital, then you have a very interesting contrast between state forms and juridical forms. Like, what's the relationship between the state form in bits of the global south or Latin America with the juridicalized IMF and World Bank and stuff like this? And this is really crucial for thinking through those kind of the ways in which those modes of accumulation come into play, and the way in which this can articulate the forms of motion of capital, I think. But I still want to caution against people putting that backwards. It's very clear that these juridical forms and this state reconfiguration responds to a particular crisis in the accumulation of capital, and that shapes what becomes effective. And to not get that point, I think, is to fall into a certain kind of like legal and state fetishism about the way in which these things can do and what they can do in that context.
Thank you. No questions? No.
Thanks for the talk. I have a question, which is, what do you think law in a post-capitalist society would be?
It would. It's what I actually think. This becomes a complicated question, and it can become like a kind of, I always worry about this question becoming like a kind of like really boring semantic question, which I don't want it to be. But I think the crucial thing to understand, right, is that like, this is kind of actually first point, but I think it's an important point. Like, law and rules or norms are not the same thing. Because even right now, although law is the predominant form through which social norms present itself, we can obviously articulate like social norms and rules, which we recognize as not being legal, right? So part of the concern then is that, of course, there will be forms of social regulation, like in post-capitalist legal orders, and they're going to have to like complicate that question. They won't look anything like what law is now. You can call it whatever the fuck you want, I think is the point, but it will be significantly, radically different from the mode in which we organize like juridical relations, that it would look like it wouldn't, I don't know that it would make sense to articulate it in that way. So that's the one. And I'm going to come back to that in a second, but I also don't talk about, red lemonade in the sea, so I don't want to speculate too much. The second point, of course, is that I think that if you understand the kind of interrelationship between like law and capitalist social relations society, that also means we're not dealing with like a situation in which like there's law and then there's not law. We're dealing with a significant period of transition in which law is messed about with. It looks very different. What I would imagine that happens in a kind of transitional period is like further like democratization of law in various ways, a kind of generalization of it out, moving away from like the juridical mechanisms generally for resolving lots of disputes, which in some sense comes back to your old kind of like Marxist formulation about the degree to which these things can be like reabsorbed into like the social metabolism as opposed to being carried out by specialized separate bodies. I don't like to speculate too much because like unfortunately I'll be dead before that happens unless they can preserve my brain in the back, but I don't think they can. So, but I do think that what will essentially, what we have seen in various kind of historical transitional moments is, for instance, like moves towards like more kind of like mediation-y type things because there's less sharp opposition of like property in that kind of way. like decentralized initiatives around stuff like justice, like attempts to essentially be like, what is the way that we can just reconcile this as opposed to whatever? And of course, that starts to get into like other terrain, which I just don't think I'm in a position to talk about right now. But the headline is like, of course, there will be like disputes post-capitalism, and of course, there will be mechanisms of settling those. I can't describe exactly what they're going to look like. I can say what they won't look like. And I can say, which I think is an important thing to say, as we kind of know, like law has not been the predominant mechanism through which human beings settle their disputes. It hasn't. It's a relatively recent, in the grand scheme of human history, invention. And in terms of it being like the primary mode of that happening, that's incredibly recent in the span of human history.
Thank you. So following on from that slightly, there's a quote. I'm interested in your sense of what is possible now in what is regrettably very much a non-revolutionary situation. I'm thinking about a quote from Kostas Lapavitsas in, I think, 2015, where he basically said, the dirty secret of Marxists is that in a Marxist economists and in a non-revolutionary situation, all we have is are Keynesian tools. Now, there are clearly Marxist economists who disagree with that, but there are also those who don't. And one of the things that you would, I think the point you make, brilliant point about essentially particular capital moments of capitalism as presenting, if you like, a band of possibilities beyond which, you know, certain things are utopian, which that might change in the future. And there was a point at which Keynesianism like stopped working. If Kostas is right about that, then there are essentially moments of capitalism where it's revolution or nothing. There's basically nothing we can put on the table. So what I'm wondering, particularly in the crisis of neoliberalism, is both in a specifically economic sense, but also in the juridical sense that is both the expression and the articulation of that economics. What now?
So that's a good point. And that's a kind of a strategy and tactics point to reference a thing I wrote 700 years ago. But I think this is really important. So the thing that I would say is that account is true, but it's also untrue, because we can go back to the kind of history of thinking about this stuff in terms of non-reformist reforms, in terms of debates on reform and revolution, which say, well, there's being Keynesian and there's being a Keynesian. Like there's advocating in specific contexts certain specific Keynesian measures for reasons other than simply constructing Keynesianism, which is like, oh, well, is this going to strengthen the balance of class forces? Is this going to push things in a certain kind of way? Is this building up a project in a certain like ruptural moment? And then there's traditional Keynesianism, which is like, oh, well, we're building Keynesianism to save capitalism. And that's also where a kind of crucial political question comes in too, right? Because part of the problem with people talking about Keynesianism is that what we also know is that Keynesianism is a pacification project, because it's a project of technocracy. It's a project which is deliberately often depoliticizing in particular kinds of ways. And it is ultimately, and I think this is crucial, a project that every time when push came to shove was like, how do we arbitrate between the interests of capital and labor? We can imagine, as Marxists in particular conjunctures, arguing for Keynesian measures, firstly being fully aware that that will like push the antagonism, and then be like, well, now we're going to push beyond the antagonism. Thinking about what that means in terms of like forms of class organization and in terms of ruptural forms in particular kind of ways, but then being realistic about what that might mean, right? Like, so if you take in the context of like the Greek situation, like it's very clear that when push came to shove, the Keynesianism that was on offer was a non-ruptural one, because it was like, when faced with the prospect of a rupture of the European Union, it would have in many respects been like a revolutionary like gamble. It didn't go that way. It was like, okay, this is what we do. Compromise. So my answer, and this is also then the crucial thing, I think, about why, if you want to be a serious, even quasi-reformist, stop thinking that law does everything and start thinking about what law can and can't do in context. Because now you can start saying like, well, if this is what my map of the laws of motion of capital is, in what point can I apply this kind of legal pressure in a way that will make it more effective, more antagonistic? So as opposed to thinking I can do literally everything, being like, well, I know I can't, but where is this point, understanding this, where this might have a little bit more, or this might have a little bit more vulnerability? The irony, I think, is that if you have the best social democrats are Marxists, because they understand the way in which the system functions and they understand where they can apply pressure, right? There's a reason for that kind of emergence. Ironically, the kind of contemporary social democrats who have a kind of, I think, quite utopian imaginary of what the juridical and political can are shit social democrats, right? Like, and so I think that's the three things I would then say are, there are ways, like, there's using Keynesian tools and there's being a Keynesian, and I think those two things are different. There's a perspective you can take on what it is that you're aiming for and how you're using those tools, which like does seriously mark people out. But even to be an efficient, effective reformist, you know, it's good to know how the system functions.
Can I abuse my role as chair?
You're the chair. I think you have the
I will, because I think I'll build a bit on what China has said, but also what you said, and I'm not sure I'll get to the question straight away, but I'm just thinking about the extent to which the account that you also presented, and more generally within law, we think within too rigid a binary. And I would want to ask, you know, in addition to the fact that we don't take seriously what are the laws of motions of capital, so the necessity, okay? What still, okay, so law cannot be the strategy because there's always, we hit a dead end, which is the laws of motion. But still, it doesn't tell us about what legal tactics are or are not on the table, what form they should take, or what those means, the range of these middle solutions perhaps can be. And I'm trying to think about how we think about this in between, which is really crucial kind of. And I want to ask you, but maybe it's completely off. In Marx, okay, there's laws of what you have called laws of motions, which are almost sort of natural, quasi-natural in the sense that they are like embedded logics.
They appear.
But also, they arise at a particular stage of capitalist development, right? Because on the full subsumption, on the generalization, right? I mean, he doesn't imply that these are totalizing in that kind of way. But then he also very often talks about something else, which I wonder how you would qualify them. For example, I'm thinking in the Communist Manifesto, where he described the whole revolutionary process. And he says, for example, you know, the concentration of capital and labor means that suddenly we have a space, a factory, where the possibility of revolution arises because there's a concentration of laborers and he described the way by which we move from economic interest to politicization, etc. Sort of. And I'm just wondering, how do we qualify these laws? And for lawyers to have a better real intervention into what the law can or cannot do, we need to study those tendencies as well. So not the laws of motions, not the pure contingents, but the tendencies that are produced in specific historical moments. For example, now you might say, well, fuck that, because after the pandemic, none of us work in the same, and you saw how hard it is to get people on a bloody picket line. Everybody's not there, you know. So, and I just wonder, do you see an in-between space in which we have to begin theorizing more seriously? And that's like in between laws, they are scientific laws, but also contingent, but neither one or the other to sort of determine what we can do with law.
Yeah, I mean, I just agree with that. I mean, the thing I would say is that I don't think that those, I don't think you're even saying this, but I don't think that those, part of the Marxist insight is those things are not separate, right? As in, like, those in-between moments have to also be understood in the shadow of these broader, like, organizational political questions. And indeed, there are moments in which, like, these broader laws of motion, like, are made accurate and made to happen. We couldn't understand the form of social organization post the pandemic without understanding the kind of the needs of accumulation which came in the context that way. Like, so much. Yeah. So within that, then, yes, we absolutely do need to do that. But to say, I think, a very like obvious but I still think true point is that's also, I think, a question that ironically is not just an intellectual question. It's a kind of, it just is an intellectual organizational question. As in, it's like, well, how are the ways in which you gain knowledge of these kind of transformations? Well, traditionally, what it would have been is through organizations in which intellectuals and workers support together in ways where and it can teach knowledge, as a horrible term, but in which, you know, the way in which you gain the intelligence of these things going on was through like concrete forms of organization, which I think is that's the thing that encourages mid-level. Because I would even call it theorizing. I think theorizing is like would be the wrong, it would overly intellectualize it in ways, but I think it's really important.
Also, that part of it could be intellectualized in the sense that Marx also saw laws of tendencies.
Yeah.
Scientific in the sense of culturally rather than laws of motions that have the character you just described, such as the tendency of the rate of profit.
Yeah, I think that's right, but I still think that I mean, I mean, nothing's just a matter of theory, right? That's a kind of crucial point. But I think that the mode of intellectual reflection on that stuff is often also best articulated in this, that also sometimes becomes an organizational question. Like, why aren't lawyers talking about this? Why aren't like critical legal theorists talking about this? Because they're not in their union. Like, because they're not on their picket lines. They can't think about this mode in this kind of way. Like, there is something to that. But no, I do think absolutely that's kind of the key task. But the distinctive thing that, and this is why I said these things are connected, that Marxists and the other people would situate those moments within that broader sweep, right? Because of course the problem is often that ground is just ceded to people who want to do like empirical whatever things, doing ethnography or something like that, which isn't helpful. So I really do agree with that, because that maps onto this, exactly you said, the China thing was like, this is part of a way of mapping those opportunities. But that's why I think those two things go like hand in hand. So like a kind of weird but I think useful example is like, you know, like half a decade ago there's that kind of explosion, people talk about logistics, right? It's like, but actually when you're thinking about logistics and that kind of concrete middle ground thing, you also want to think about like Capital Volume 2, about the role that logistics played in like studies of capital, about how you situate that middle ground stuff into the broader things, because that starts to tell you like what might be more effective at disrupting what in what way. So I really agree with you, but I also think the distinctive thing that Marx is doing in that sense is still bring that stuff back in, because otherwise, you know, because that's what we do.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering, do you have any book recommendations to explore the concepts you discussed further?
His book. What I will tell you is, if you email me, I will regale you with endless and boring book lists. There's some stuff, like China's book is definitely a book. I'd maybe say articles right now too. I mean, there are some good books too, but like a lot of the article books, just drop me an email and I'll try not to recommend too much of my own work.
Hi, Rob. Thanks for sharing this presentation. You said something about law in global sphere being quite different in the sense that you have other levels of analysis, which makes it a bit difficult to immediately apply the same sort of thoughts. I mean, some of them can be applied. And I was thinking about the global sphere being different, that law has a different function. You can probably still define it in the sense of law as a constituent element of capitalism. And that in international law, you have rules that you can call them, they kind of tackle the fears. Capitalism, crisis, you have antagonism, and you can kind of make promises about future improvement. They're not exactly law, but like we consider it international law, we see them as law. So you have this other function of law as tackling fears, setting new standards, making promises about future. Is that constituent function of law?
I mean, in some ways it would be a bit of a different kind of constitutive function, I think. Like, so one of the things I think that so I would say, just to start the question, I think what we're talking about is a difference of degree, not kind. Like I do think that these, like law is a given phenomenon, like shared, and it shares that kind of core logic, but the way in which it articulates is very different depending on the particular scale and just articulate it. And indeed, one of the things that is true of international law, and one of the reasons why I think it's particularly bad for anything, is the scale at which it's articulated is the least responsive to any kind of form of popular recognition, and therefore it's in many respects the least useful for any kind of political project or subject making, right? And what you're describing then is a kind of, if we like, we could think of it as a kind of almost like a negative constitutive function of law, which is to articulate a set of like whatever desires, hopes, dreams, which it writing checks it can't cash, but nonetheless articulate a certain kind of political subject in a particular way. So the thing I'm thinking of literally right now, something I write about, is like ecocide laws, and like the kind of political subject that ecocide laws are attempting to call into being is the least useful political subject for dealing with like climate change that you could possibly imagine. It's like, let's go to the ICC. But the point is that it is serving that function of like constituting a form of political subjectivity and then situating that in that kind of way. So I think that is absolutely one of the things that happens, and international law is particularly good at doing that, in part because it can, on some levels, because of its distance, embody a kind of like false hope, but precisely through that, it's a kind of disorganizational form as well. So I really agree with that.
Great. Maybe we'll have time for one more question if somebody wants to.
You don't have to.
You don't need to.
Why do you think, so in political activism, often the activists will go to the law. And you've been noting that this is a problem. Why do you think the law is so seductive? Why do they want to go there and not look for other discourses, other forms of strategy?
So I'll give you two answers, maybe three, but one answer is a kind of like, we'll call it like a philosophical-ish answer, but then we can come up with some practical things. Like, I think that like, given that legal relations are like a form of reference of capitalist social relations, and they're one of the ways in which we like very directly live capitalist social relations, they're often like the spontaneous ideology, like, you know, in austerity, that's what you read for, because we are saturated so much already in the juridical that is the case. And to be honest, that's not even just a kind of intellectual failure. That is also a fact that it's like, well, there's no escaping the juridical relations. The things you do are going to have juridical consequences. So it's not just a kind of like, oh, I've chosen or not chosen to do this. It's like very often it's like, well, of course that's what you are, because that's what you're doing. So it's both the seductive power because of the way in which like law structures so much of our experience, and also on a very literal sense, that's what's available to us. Beyond that, though, I think there are a series of like important political things that law appears to do, which seem very useful. So one reason why I think it is important to do a kind of depoliticizing, like, repoliticizing the law is that for many, many people, what they see the law as doing is offering a kind of a trump to hard work, right? Law often appears to you as it's like, I can either engage in like very messy political argument in which there are oppositions or enemies, or I can go, it's the law. So you've got to follow the law. So will you do that thing? It appears to be a shortcut to like achieving political transformation. Fuck it, everyone wants a shortcut. Like I'm not even against that idea of happening, but it appears to offer that to people. And of course, the thing that we would reply is, well, no, law appears to be politicized, but in fact embeds a particular mode or form of politicization. But it appears in that way as doing that. And what that also means, because of this kind of important function that law plays in capitalist social relations, is it often feels like a good way to build a coalition. It's like, well, we don't have to have a political disagreement. That's what we're talking about as a legal reform. We're talking about just enforcing the law. So it kind of looks effective. It builds coalitions. It also looks like it can do action very quickly because of the nature of that. But of course, all of that comes with the logic of the way in which the legal form functions, which ultimately would cut against that. But as a kind of thing that you are confronted with, it makes perfect sense to me that it would operate in that way. And of course, in a particular conjuncture in which political transformative alternatives have been like smashed, of course, law appears in this sense as a way of like of dealing with that. And so, you know, actually, I've always said this, but I do think one of the things that like lawyers can always do politically is be like this won't work. Don't do this. Don't do this. Don't do this. Don't do this. Like even in like if you think about even like our trade union. Like the amount of people that are just like, but actually, it's like, no, stop it. Like, no. And you know, like half the time in branch committee meetings, I'm just called in to be like, this is what we do. Like, and I think that's important.
Thanks so much, Rob. And yeah, please join me in the
Speaking like